In 756, Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, gave a large portion of the Italian peninsula to Pope Stephen II. By this time, tensions had grown between Rome and Constantinople. Constantinople was supposed to protect Rome, as the city of Rome was part of the Byzantine Empire, but it had left Rome fairly undefended and subject to barbarian invasions. These large territories in the Italian peninsula became known as the Papal States, and were primarily for the protection of Rome. When this land was given to the Pope, it meant that he wasn't just the sovereign leader of the Catholic Church, he was also the sovereign over the Papal States. In 1861, Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia became king of a new kingdom, the Kingdom of Italy, and over the course of about a decade, the Kingdom of Italy conquered the Papal States. By 1870, there was one city left to conquer, the city of Rome, the home of the Pope and the last city under his temporal control. And as the Kingdom of Italy was encroaching on the city, the bishops were gathered there at the Vatican for the Catholic Church's 20th Ecumenical Council. Hi, this is Justin Hibbard, and you're listening to Why Catholic, my podcast about the what and why of Catholicism. If you're new to this podcast, I'm a former evangelical pastor and Protestant apologist, and at the age of 41, I came home to the Catholic Church. In this podcast, I take complex theological concepts and historical events and try to break them down into bite-sized pieces in episodes that are about 17 minutes in length. Just as a reminder, it takes a lot of work to make these podcast episodes. And so if you've benefited from Why Catholic, I'd love for you to become a supporter. You can support Why Catholic by going to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Even just a little support goes a long way. Thank you for your generosity. Since episode 146, we've been in a series on the 21 Ecumenical Church Councils, and we're getting so close to the end with just 2 councils left, Vatican I and Vatican II. As we've seen throughout this series, sometimes there's a flurry of councils that meet within a short period of time. In fact, the Council of Constance said that there should be an ecumenical council every 10 years. However, that just proved to be unrealistic. 10 years was just too short of a time between councils. However, by the time the Catholic Church convened the First Vatican Council, which we'll talk about today, it had been a whopping 306 years since its last ecumenical council, the Council of Trent, which concluded in 1563. This was the longest period of time between general or ecumenical councils since the first ecumenical council was convened in Nicaea in 325. A lot happened in those 300 years between 1563 and 1869. There was the Baroque, Classical, and Romantic periods for the arts. The Industrial Revolution saw vast efficiencies in technological development as population growth began to soar. There were all sorts of new ideas of governments, including socialism and republics. Some of them were spawned by major revolutions like the American and the French Revolution. And this was the Age of Enlightenment, filled with scientific discoveries, rationalism, and philosophies on government. The world was changing drastically, and the Catholic Church, like it did in the past, wrestled with its place in the world. And at the same time, it was entering a new era, where its temporal powers were shrinking as the Kingdom of Italy conquered the Papal States. The Pope for a good portion of the 19th century was Pope Pius IX. His pontificate began in 1846, and he would reign until 1878, a total of 32 years, the longest verified of any pope, though it's believed that St. Peter reigned longer. He was thought to be a liberal reformer, but he proved to be rather conservative. Besides convening the First Vatican Council, he's also known for promulgating the Immaculate Conception as a dogma of the Catholic Church in 1854. In 1864, Pope Pius IX published a document called the Syllabus of Errors, which listed 80 propositions that he felt were social errors or heresies, including pantheism, socialism, communism, rationalism, and liberalism. I've linked to this document in the show notes. Later in 1864, Pope Pius IX surveyed the cardinals residing around Rome to see if they would be in favor of an ecumenical council. The response was overwhelmingly in favor, and by 1865, Pope Pius IX began laying down the groundwork for what would be the Church's 20th Ecumenical Council. He sent out invitations not only to Catholic bishops, but also leaders in the Orthodox and Protestant churches. When the First Vatican Council convened on December 8, 1869 at St. Peter's Basilica, about 700 church leaders were in attendance. At first, Pope Pius said that he would merely be an observer of the council. In fact, for many, it was unclear why a general council was even convened. It didn't seem to have clear direction, like at previous councils where the Pope stated his objectives with an opening sermon. But as the council continued, Pope Pius took a more active role, and the purpose of the council became clear. Session 2 occurred about a month later on Epiphany, January 6, 1870. In this session, Pope Pius and the bishops accepted a statement of faith. The purpose of this session was really to further substantiate and enshrine decisions made at previous councils. So it began with the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, which was the work of the first two ecumenical councils in 325 and 381, and then it affirmed the Council of Trent as a legitimate ecumenical council. Its decisions and doctrines were binding, and it went on to specifically articulate many of the doctrines of Trent. The third session was held 4 months later on April 24, 1870. One thing to understand is that the councils don't just twiddle their thumbs between sessions. There's lots of work being done in committees, and then the work is brought forth in front of a session for a general vote. In this case, the work done was a doozy. It was the dogmatic constitution on the Catholic faith. Think of this as a comprehensive catechism that defined what the Catholic Church believes and teaches. If you remember all the way back in episode 146, the introduction of this series, I mentioned that not all doctrine is dogmatically defined. Generally, what happens is that you have doctrine, which is the consensus teaching and understanding of the church. Then someone comes along and seriously challenges that doctrine to the point that it sows major division in the church. Then the church will meet as a council and dogmatically settle the debate. Thus, when that happens, the church is essentially saying, okay, this matter has been settled. It has been put to bed. The debate is over. There is no more questioning this. So with the dogmatic constitution of the Catholic faith, Pope Pius and the bishops were dogmatically defining many Catholic beliefs that had been questioned by Protestantism and by secular rationalism and all sorts of new belief systems. There are 4 major sections to this constitution, and each lists a series of Catholic teachings on God, the creator of all things, on revelation, on faith and reason. Session 4 occurred on July 18, 1870, and perhaps this is what the First Vatican Council is most known for, the dogmatic constitution of the Church of Christ. You might be thinking, wait a second, didn't they just pass a dogmatic constitution? Yes, but that was on the Catholic faith. This is on the Catholic Church, and one of the major issues they were going to dogmatically define was papal infallibility. There were a couple of questions that the notion of papal infallibility raised. First, can the Pope even act infallibly? In other words, are there times that the Pope can do something and the faithful are to submit to that decision as the binding authority, not just made by a man, but a man inspired by the Holy Spirit? And if so, when is that? Is that any time the Pope decides something, or is there a limited scope? And furthermore, there's always the question of whether this belief should be dogmatically defined in the first place, because once it's dogmatically defined, it is binding. Now, there was little disagreement that a pope could be infallible. After all, the Church has treated many of St. Peter's decisions, and of course his writings, as infallible. But then we see at times when the Pope has weighed in on matters in a way that the Church might have considered it to be infallible teaching. One of them that comes to mind is Pope Leo's tome, which was influential in the Council of Chalcedon of 451. On July 13, 1870, a preliminary vote on the section on infallibility was held in a general congregation. Basically, let's see where we all stand on this issue. 451 voted in favor, 88 against, and 62 in favor, but on condition of some amendment. So it was clear that a dogmatic statement on papal infallibility would pass. However, about 20% were not totally in favor, and so the council decided to limit the scope of papal infallibility. They added an amendment that the Pope has, quote, full and supreme power of jurisdiction over the whole Church when he speaks ex cathedra, end quote. They went on to define ex cathedra, which means from his chair, to be, quote, when in the exercise of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals to be held by the whole Church. He possesses, by the divine assistance promised to him in Blessed Peter, that infallibility which the divine Redeemer willed his Church to enjoy in defining doctrine concerning faith or morals, end quote. In other words, papal infallibility is limited to specific circumstances. It's not blanket authority, and it has to be related to faith and morals. So, for example, if the Pope establishes or revises the Code of Canon Law, that isn't an issue of faith and morals. He can do that because he has supreme jurisdiction over the whole Church, but the next Pope can come in and create a whole new Code of Canon Law. On July 18, 1870, at the fourth session of the Council, a vote was taken. 60 members had decided to leave so as not to be associated with the approval of the new constitution, and particularly this section on papal infallibility. 533 voted in favor, and only 2 voted against it. I'll say a little bit more about this decision on papal infallibility in a few minutes, but let's first talk about the rest of the First Vatican Council. The original plan was to adjourn for the remainder of the summer. However, that plan was thrown off by political turmoil. French troops had been protecting the city of Rome. However, they were severely weakened in their war against Prussia. And eventually, on September 20th, 1870, the Kingdom of Italy overtook the last of the Pope's temporal territories, the city of Rome. Pope Pius IX was essentially a prisoner in his own city. 1 month later, on October 20th, 1870, Pope Pius IX issued a bull suspending the council indefinitely. There was discussion and attempts to revive the council with no success. A number of documents remained unfinished. There were a number of opposition movements to the First Vatican Council, particularly because of papal infallibility. Some countries, like France, took steps to create a separation of church and state, as they saw it if the Pope could act infallibly, then he could wield that power with great influence over a particular country. A small schism developed in the Catholic Church that eventually became known as the Old Catholic Church. Really, it was a unification of a couple of other schismatic groups, mainly a group known as the Jansennists, and in 1930, the Old Catholic Church came into full communion with the Anglican Church. It has since splintered over issues like female ordination and same-sex unions. Pope Pius IX reigned as Pope until February 7, 1878, 8 years after the conclusion of the First Vatican Council. He was a popular pope, and really a diplomat during a time of revolution. He refused to recognize the Kingdom of Italy as a legitimate country, and he even excommunicated its king, Victor Emmanuel II. Pope Pius outlived his adversary, King Victor Emmanuel, by 1 month, and just before Victor's death, Pope Pius lifted his excommunication and absolved him of all his sins. Even gravely ill, Pope Pius IX said Mass daily, and he died while praying the Rosary. Efforts to canonize him as a saint were thwarted by the Italian government, but once the Kingdom of Italy was no more, there was no further opposition. He was beatified on September 3rd, 2000. Let me end with this. I've talked about papal infallibility in other episodes on this podcast, particularly episode 104 called The Nuclear Football, part of my series on Catholicism and politics, and in episode 111 on my series on the papacy. I think this dogma is a big deterrent that keeps people from further considering Catholicism. But I think people think about this decision incorrectly. This wasn't the first time a pope was considered to have infallibility. Throughout history, it's believed that the pope could exercise infallibility, though it was a little nebulous. This was the first time where papal infallibility was specifically limited. But the purpose of papal infallibility is a lot like the nuclear football that the President of the United States carries around. It's considered a negative charism. In other words, it's not a type of power to be wielded. It's there for the most extreme circumstances when a matter of division needs to be settled decisively and quickly. In reality, a pope that utilizes his power really is at a disadvantage. It will be criticized by people inside and outside the church. They'll say, why make a unilateral decision when you could have convened a council or consulted bishops? Pope John XXIII once remarked, quote, I am only infallible if I speak infallibly, but I shall never do that, so I am not infallible, end quote. In 2005, Pope Benedict XVI stated, quote, the Pope is not an oracle, he is infallible in very rare situations as we know, end quote. Since it was dogmatically defined in 1870, the only time that a pope has exercised papal infallibility was in 1950 when Pope Pius XII promulgated the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. However, even this came after consulting with and surveying the bishops. The essential question isn't how much power should the pope have, but rather what type of person, what type of character should occupy the chair of St. Peter. Like the presidency, the more power that is open to them, the more it behooves us to carefully select a person that will not be eager to exercise that ultimate power. The topic of papal infallibility always brings to mind one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite books, Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Quote, the one specifically and peculiarly unchristian idea is the idea of Carlyle, the idea that the man should rule who feels that he can rule. Whatever else is Christian, this is heathen. If our faith comments on government at all, its comment must be this, that the man should rule who does not think that he can rule. Carlyle's hero may say, I will be king, but the Christian saint must say, nolo episcopari. If the great paradox of Christianity means anything, it means this, that we must take the crown in our hands and go hunting in dry places and dark corners of the earth until we find the one man who feels himself unfit to wear it. Carlyle was quite wrong. We have not got to crown the exceptional man who knows he can rule. Rather, we must crown the much more exceptional man who knows he can't." End quote. Thank you for joining me for Why Catholic. Be sure to subscribe to Why Catholic wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to my Substack site and get the next episode in your email inbox. As a subscriber, you get a special discount code to the Why Catholic Etsy store. If you've been blessed by this podcast and you're feeling generous, there's also a way to financially support it, and patrons get some extra perks. To become a free subscriber or a patron, just go to whycatholic.substack.com/subscribe. Also join me on Instagram at whycatholicpodcast, all one word. Thanks again for listening. My name is Justin Hibbard, and this is Why Catholic. God bless you.